Hi readers. We are continuing in this story set with our tradition of postmodernism with excerpts from Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five, and Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. These are great examples of metafiction, of skepticism, of many of the qualities of the postmodern ideology, and they're also linked in that they both focus on a singular topic, which is the experiences of war. The first author that you're reading is very near and dear to my heart, Kurt Vonnegut, and you're reading the first chapter of his masterpiece, Slaughterhouse-Five. Now, Slaughterhouse-Five is often counted among the most important American novels ever. I would put it in my top 3 favorite novels of all time, and it is definitely a very important example of what was going on in the American literary tradition at the time. And the first chapter in particular is a great sort of a microscopic look at what Kurt Vonnegut is doing and how he's using these techniques of postmodernism to convey very profound ideas with many different layers. To give you an idea of Kurt Vonnegut's ethos as a writer, I want to read to you an excerpt from his obituary. He died in 2006, and this was a piece of what they wrote about him in Time magazine. Vonnegut's sincerity, his willingness to scoff at received wisdom, is such that reading his work for the first time gives one the sense that everything else is rank hypocrisy. His opinion of human nature was low, and that low opinion applied to his heroes and his villains alike. He was endlessly disappointed in humanity and in himself, and he expressed that disappointment in a mixture of tar-black humor and deep despair. He could have easily become a crank, but he was too smart. He could have become a cynic, but there was something tender in his nature that he could never quite suppress. He could have become a bore, but even at his most despairing, he had an endless willingness to entertain his readers with drawings, jokes, sex, bizarre plot twists, science fiction, whatever it took. And there's really, I think that puts it perfectly. Kurt Vonnegut, there is a lot of pessimism and sort of disenchantment with the world in Kurt Vonnegut, and for good reason. His life was full of much tragedy and trauma. However, underneath it all is this paradoxical sense of love and hope and optimism that I think makes him just a wonderful author. I highly recommend. I always tell people, if you think you don't like to read, you should read Kurt Vonnegut. So let's talk about Slaughterhouse-Five. Slaughterhouse-Five is considered his masterpiece, and it is based on his experiences in World War II. It is fiction. Most of the novel, or the entire novel, is centered around this character, Billy Pilgrim, who has become unstuck in time. And he sort of moves around to different points in his life in a non-linear way, which is very postmodern. He has talks about his experiences with Tralfamadorians, which are Kurt Vonnegut's alien race that he's made up in many of his works. It's science fiction, it's funny, it's profound, it's weird, it's so many different things. But you're reading the first chapter, and the first chapter is Kurt Vonnegut, the writer, talking about writing the book. And writing this book, there's a lot of context that's helpful to understand. So, to give you an idea of Kurt Vonnegut's experiences that are informing this book and why it is so sort of big, he was born in 1922 in Indianapolis, and he joins the Army during World War II. He enlists. In 1944, May of 1944, his mother committed suicide, which was very devastating to him, as it would be. And this was when he was home from the war, but he went back. As he was serving, he was at the Battle of the Bulge, which happened in December of 1944, so just the same year of his mother's death. At the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive took about 6,000 American troops prisoner, and one of those troops was Kurt Vonnegut. So he is taken as a prisoner of war to the city of Dresden in Germany. Now, at the time, Dresden was considered like the Paris of Germany. It was a city of architecture and culture and art, and it was this city. that had a lot of rich history and tradition in it. It was also, Kurt Vonnegut described it as the most beautiful city he had ever seen. And so he is taken to Dresden as a prisoner of war in December of 1944. And in May of 1945, a few months later, Dresden is firebombed. Now, Dresden was not a military stronghold, and estimates suggest that anywhere between 100,000 and 250,000 civilians were killed in the firebombing. It was one of the most devastating events in World War II. So just to give you some context, this is a photo of Dresden prior to the bombings, and this is a photo of Dresden after. The city was completely destroyed. And Kurt Vonnegut was a prisoner of war at the time, and he and his comrades were able to take shelter in an underground meat locker, which is where the title comes from, Slaughterhouse-Five. So, he took shelter during those bombings, and when he emerged, he described it as the city was just gone. And you can see, of course, in the photos that had happened. Now, at the time, he is 22, 23. He's just gone through his mother's death. He's at war experiencing, war is already traumatic and causes a lot of emotional strife for the people who serve in them. And then he has witnessed this unfathomable atrocity in terms of loss of human life. Men, women, and children covering the streets, the whole city on fire. He's witnessed something that's almost incomprehensible in terms of its magnitude. And he's still a prisoner in a city that had just been devastated. And he was, him and his comrades were representatives of the side that had done this to the Germans. So the prisoners of war were tasked with cleaning up the bodies after the Dresden bombing. So he once described it as the world's worst Easter egg hunt. There were just bodies all over the streets, and it was their job to collect them into funeral pyres to be burned. And I think it's important to just imagine what it would be like to have gone through all of that. And while, these prisoners of war collecting the bodies, they're being taunted and yelled at, and rocks are getting thrown at them by German people who are also devastated at what's happened to them. Think about, going through all of that as a 22-year-old man, very young. Now, this, of course, had a profound influence on who he was in his whole life. So in that bit of the obituary that I've read to you that talks about how he's disappointed in humanity and full of deep despair, I think that, you can see how that would become a foundational part of his identity given what he had seen. Now, an interesting thing to note about his reaction to Dresden, I'll share with you the letter that he wrote home to his family. He very often describes it in very plain terms. He's not very emotional about it. He actually, later in his life, described it as, it was kind of just, the great adventure of my lifetime, which sounds almost, which would probably sound surprising. But there was, psychological research done on German survivors of World War II. So civilians who had witnessed bombings, during the war. And what they have found is that people who see these sorts of events, these catastrophes, these bombings, these mass casualties, often dissociate from them and can't find don't use a lot of words or description to explain them. And that's because, how do you put that into words? How do you describe that? And some would even say that it's because our brains are not capable of comprehending what, the devastation in front of it. One of my former students, who is a combat veteran, made a great point about this that I will share with you. Shout out Isaac. And that is that, we are not built to see people get blown apart. We are not built to see piles of each other in human casualties. That doesn't exist in nature, and our brains aren't made for that. But in the modern war era, because of, man-made technology, now we do. And our psychology is just not equipped for that. I think that's a great point, that you see that a lot in Kurt Vonnegut. So Kurt Vonnegut returns home from the war in May of 1945. He still, remains a prisoner for several months after the Dresden bombings. He returns home and he begins his writing career. He publishes his first novel, Player Piano, in 1952, publishes many, many short stories, several other novels, has a family, gets married. He becomes a professor at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is the most prestigious creative writing MFA program in the country. And all of this time he is he's publishing other things, but he's trying to figure out how to write about Dresden because he feels like he has to write about Dresden. But how do you write about Dresden? In a documentary about his life on Hulu, his family talks about what was going on in the years that he was writing Slaughterhouse-Five, and they said he probably wrote 5,000 pages trying to get this story out. And this was, by the way, back in the day when he was writing on a typewriter. So, if he would write 200 pages and start over, he would just scrap the whole thing. He tried to write this story for many, many years, and it actually took 25 years of his life before Slaughterhouse-Five was published. It was published in 1969. And the first chapter talks about that experience, sort of what it was like writing this, how he is approaching the story, and it also provides this anecdote of him speaking to his war buddy's wife, and they have a conversation about what kind of war story he's going to tell. And within the literary tradition, war stories up until this point are often represented as a sort of adventure that makes boys into men. There are, think of like the frontier hero, this idea of like facing battle and coming out this strong, resilient hero. That's a trope that shows up in much literature. But one way that Slaughterhouse-Five has been described is as revising this myth that war makes boys into men and exposing the psychological trauma that young men have gone through because of war and because of the nuclear age, and that is sort of what they're discussing in this chapter. So Slaughterhouse-Five, this is a copy, one of the more common printings that's sold today. Fun fact, these drawings on the cover of this series are all drawn by Kurt Vonnegut. And it's also often referred to as just Slaughterhouse-Five, which comes from that meat locker. However, the original title, this is, I always get excited to show students this. This is one of my most prized possessions. This is a first edition Slaughterhouse-Five from the 1969 printing. You can see it's covered in plastic because it's the coolest book that I own. But you can see it was published with the title The Children's Crusade. And he talks in the first chapter about why it was published with that title. And he would go on throughout his life to talk about how, he was such a young man when this happened to him, and he sort of carried resentment, as he should, throughout his whole life about what had happened to him in Dresden. I also think that it is interesting to know that while this is considered probably the most enduring anti-war novel in the American tradition, a very important novel in the American tradition, it's also a very controversial novel in the American tradition. One of the most frequently banned books across the country, still to this day. It was banned in school districts often. And it does contain, sex, violence, language, some sort of vulgar, obscene situations. It questions religion in a way that makes many uncomfortable. It is not, it's not everybody's cup of tea for sure. And so it's often banned in school districts, especially during the 70s, during the Vietnam War. Famously, one school district in North Dakota, long story short, a teacher had assigned it to their high school class. A parent, happened upon it, was horrified at what they saw in there, took it to the school district, and they agreed. They collected all of the books and they threw them in the school's furnace. And this made national headlines, book burning, right? Not just banning, but actually burning of them. And Kurt Vonnegut famously responded in a letter that's titled I Am Very Real. And in that letter, he talks about how, and this is a story with aliens and, time travel and all of these sort of fantastical things. But in this letter, he talks about how this is real. His experiences, his truth in Dresden is what this book is. And he wrote this book to convey what had happened to him as what he considered to be a child. And for him to hear that this school district found that real experience told in his postmodern way to be inappropriate for children. Of course, he found this to be very offensive. As well, if you're not aware, during World War II, Nazi book burning was a big part of the propaganda campaign, and so to hear that his novel was, sort of receiving the treatment that was underlying, the most significant trauma of his life, yeah, he had a strong reaction to it. I'll share that letter with you as well. I think it's really interesting to hear Kurt Vonnegut not only write about writing, but write about the world. He was a very vocal person politically, socially throughout his life, although he also famously said that we are here on earth to fart around and don't let anybody tell you any different. So he was a pessimist in many ways, but like I say, there's this strange optimism belying everything that he writes about. And in this excerpt that you are reading, I want you to be thinking about, why would he start the book this way? The whole book is about Billy Pilgrim. I mean, after the first chapter, Kurt Vonnegut, tells the story. Why would he start the book by talking about how he wrote and named and told this story? What is he beneath the surface in this first chapter? As you can probably tell, Kurt Vonnegut is my favorite writer of all time. Slaughterhouse-Five is, one of my favorite novels of all time, so I am really looking forward to discussing this one with you, as well as Tim O'Brien, who I'll talk about in just a minute, and I look forward to your thoughts on this. I'll share all the resources on Vonnegut, who is just a super interesting guy, in your notes and resources folder, but I can't wait to get into this conversation with you about Slaughterhouse-Five.